I was standing in front of my mirror, lost in thought, when I heard the faint creak of my bedroom door. I turned startled, and there he was, my stepfather. His eyes met mine, and in that moment the air grew thick. He apologized softly, but his lingering gaze said so much more. I thought it was an accident, but it was only the beginning. I never imagined my life would take such a complicated turn. Growing up, my relationship with my mother, Jennifer, was always a bit strained. She was vibrant, outgoing, and deeply invested in her social life. Her second husband, Alfred, entered our lives when I was already a teenager. While he was kind and respectful, we never developed a close bond. He was always polite, yet distant, more like a polite stranger than a father figure. Jennifer adored him, though. She loved hosting parties, attending events, and living in the spotlight, while Alfred seemed content to stand quietly at her side. Their dynamic was odd. She was carefree and spontaneous, while he was grounded and reserved. Still, they seemed happy enough, at least on the surface. For me, life at home was uneventful. I spent most of my time in my room, studying or scrolling through my phone. I never paid Alfred much attention, and I assumed he felt the same way about me. But that all changed one evening. My mother had gone out with her friends, leaving Alfred and me alone in the house. It wasn't unusual for her to disappear for hours, and I was used to being on my own. That night, I went to my room to change, thinking nothing of it. I stood in front of the mirror, wearing only my underwear, when I heard the soft creak of the door opening. "Emily, your door is open," Alfred said softly from the doorway. His voice startled me, but it was his gaze that truly unsettled me. He lingered there, his hand resting on the frame, his eyes scanning me in a way I couldn't quite place. Time seemed to freeze as I stood there, unsure whether to cover myself or speak. Finally, he stepped back, muttered an apology, and closed the door. I told myself it was just an awkward moment, nothing more. But his lingering presence stayed with me long after he left. Something had shifted in that brief encounter, something I couldn't ignore. That night, lying in bed, I found myself replaying the moment over and over, wondering if it was as innocent as I wanted to believe. The days after that night were anything but normal. I tried to convince myself that the moment with Alfred was just an awkward accident, something I could forget. But no matter how hard I tried, the memory clung to me. The way he had stood there, the look in his eyes. It stirred something inside me that I didn't fully understand, something I wasn't sure I wanted to face. Alfred, on the other hand, seemed unchanged. He carried on with his usual calm and composed demeanor, never mentioning the incident. But I started to notice things I hadn't before. The way his gaze lingered on me just a little too long, the subtle shifts in his tone when he spoke to me. Were these things always there, or was I just imagining them now? I couldn't tell, but the uncertainty gnawed at me. One evening, Jennifer announced that we were invited to a friend's wedding. She was thrilled, gushing about how beautiful it would be, but I wasn't particularly excited. Weddings weren't my thing, and the idea of spending hours in a crowded room didn't appeal to me. Still, I went along mostly because I didn't have a choice. When we arrived, the venue was buzzing with laughter and music. Jennifer, as always, was the life of the party, chatting and laughing with her friends. Alfred stood quietly by her side, his presence steady and magnetic in a way I hadn't noticed before. He looked different. The tailored suit, the way he carried himself, it all made him seem more confident, more commanding. I found my gaze drifting toward him more often than I wanted to admit. Jennifer, ever the social butterfly, was soon swept away by her friends, leaving Alfred and me alone. "Go on, ask Emily to dance," she said with a mischievous grin before disappearing into the crowd. I froze, my heart pounding as Alfred turned to me, his expression unreadable. "Shall we?" he asked, extending his hand. I wanted to say no, to find an excuse, but my body betrayed me. My hand slipped into his, and before I knew it, we were on the dance floor. His hand rested lightly on my waist, and the warmth of his touch sent a shiver through me. "You're a natural," he said with a soft smile, his voice low and soothing. I avoided his gaze, focusing on the music, but I couldn't ignore the way his touch lingered, the way his presence seemed to consume the space around us. "I'm just trying my best," I mumbled, my voice barely steady. His smile deepened. "This isn't just dancing," he said quietly. "We're sharing something here. Can't you feel it?" His words sent a jolt through me. I wanted to deny it, to dismiss the weight of his gaze, but I couldn't. The noise of the crowd faded, leaving only the two of us, moving together in a way that felt almost too intimate. The tension between us was palpable, a thread pulled tighter with every passing second. As the song ended, Alfred leaned closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. About the other day, he said, his tone hesitant but firm. I didn't mean to invade your space. I just couldn't help myself. His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. My breath caught as I tried to process what he had just said. It's fine, I replied quickly, my voice trembling. Really, it's no big deal. But it was a big deal, and we both knew it. The weight of his confession lingered between us as we returned to our seats. Jennifer reappeared, laughing and oblivious, her words a distant hum in my ears. All I could focus on was the way Alfred's eyes flicked toward me, the unspoken tension that refused to fade. That night, as we drove home, Jennifer chattered about the wedding, unaware of the charged silence between Alfred and me. Every glance, every word felt loaded, as though we were teetering on the edge of something we couldn't take back. And deep down, I knew this was far from over. The days after the wedding felt like walking on a tightrope. I couldn't shake the way Alfred had looked at me, the way his words lingered in the air like an unspoken promise. I tried to bury my feelings, to convince myself that nothing had really changed. But the truth was everything had. Alfred's presence in the house became something I couldn't ignore. His casual greetings, the way he would glance at me when he thought I wasn't looking, even the sound of his footsteps in the hallway, it all seemed amplified. I found myself hyper-aware of him, noticing every little detail in a way I never had before. And worst of all, I couldn't stop thinking about him. One evening, Jennifer announced she was going out with her friends again. It wasn't unusual. She loved her nights out, leaving Alfred and me alone in the house. I told myself it was just another evening, nothing to worry about. But as the hours passed, the tension grew unbearable. I was sitting in the living room, pretending to watch TV, when Alfred walked in. He looked calm, almost too calm, as he sat down on the couch across from me. "You don't have to keep watching if you're not enjoying it," he said with a small smile, gesturing toward the screen. "I'm fine," I replied quickly, my voice a little too high-pitched. He didn't press the matter, but the way he looked at me made my skin tingle. There was something in his eyes, something I couldn't name but couldn't ignore. The silence stretched out between us until it was almost unbearable. Finally, he spoke, his voice soft but steady. "About the wedding," he began, and my heart skipped a beat. "I hope I didn't make you uncomfortable." "That wasn't my intention." "You didn't," I said quickly, my words tumbling over themselves. "It was fine." He nodded, but his gaze didn't waver. "Good," he said after a moment. "I wouldn't want you to think I was crossing a line. But sometimes," he paused, his eyes searching mine, "sometimes it's hard to ignore the way you feel." My breath hitched, and I felt my face flush. "What do you mean?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. "You're special, Emily," he said softly, his voice carrying an intensity that made my pulse race. "You might not see it, but you are. And he trailed off, as though he couldn't bring himself to say the rest. But he didn't need to. His words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. I looked away, my mind racing. Part of me wanted to shut this down, to pretend I hadn't heard what he was saying. But another part of me, the part one didn't want to acknowledge, was drawn to him in a way that felt impossible to resist. When I finally looked back at him, his expression was unreadable. "I should go," I said quickly, standing up and grabbing my phone. But as I turned to leave, his hand reached out, gently catching my wrist. The warmth of his touch sent a shiver through me, and I froze. "Emily," he said softly, his voice almost a whisper. "You don't have to go." I turned back to him, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. For a moment, we just stood there, the air between us crackling with tension. And then, slowly, he let go of my wrist, his hand lingering for just a moment too long. That night, I couldn't sleep. The memory of his touch, the way he had looked at me, it all played over and over in my mind. I tried to convince myself that it was wrong, that I should push these feelings away. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't. The next day, Jennifer left early for another outing, leaving Alfred and me alone again. I stayed in my room trying to avoid him, but it didn't help. The thought of him lingered, pulling at me like a thread I couldn't untangle. In the late afternoon, there was a soft knock on my door. My heart raced as I opened it to find Alfred standing there, his expression both hesitant and determined. "Can we talk?" he asked softly. I nodded, stepping aside to let him in. He stood in the middle of the room, his hands in his pockets, looking like he was trying to find the right words. "I don't want to make things awkward," he said finally. "But I can't stop thinking about you, Emily. I know it's wrong, but I can't help it." His confession hit me like a wave, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. "Alfred," I began, but he cut me off. "I know," he said quickly. "I know it's complicated. But I need you to know how I feel." The room was silent, the weight of his words pressing down on me. I should have told him to leave, to forget about all of this. But instead, I found myself stepping closer to him, my heart pounding in my chest. "I feel it too," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. And in that moment, the distance between us disappeared. That moment in my room was the point of no return. As I stood there, face to face with Alfred, the air between us charged with emotions neither of us could deny, it felt as though the world outside had ceased to exist. There was only us, our breaths mingling, our hearts racing, and the unspoken connection that had been building for weeks finally coming to the surface. When Alfred's hand brushed against mine, the contact was electric, sending a shiver down my spine. "Emily," he said softly, his voice trembling ever so slightly. "We don't have to do this. Tell me to leave, and I will." But I didn't want him to leave. For so long, I had felt invisible, lost in the shadow of my mother's life, her needs always taking center stage. And now, here was someone who saw me, not as Jennifer's daughter or an afterthought, but as a woman. I couldn't ignore the way my body reacted to him, the way my heart ached with the need to feel alive, to feel wanted. "I don't want you to leave," I whispered, the words slipping out before I could stop them. Alfred's eyes searched mine, his expression a mixture of relief and hesitation. Slowly, as though giving me every chance to change my mind, he stepped closer. His hand cupped my cheek, his touch warm and grounding. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice barely audible. I nodded, unable to find the words to explain the storm of emotions inside me. And then his lips met mine. The kiss was gentle at first, almost hesitant, as though he were testing the waters. But when I didn't pull away, it deepened, a rush of passion and longing that left me breathless. His hands slid to my waist, pulling me closer, and I felt myself melting into him, my body responding instinctively to his touch. For a moment, time seemed to stop. The boundaries that had once felt so unbreakable dissolved, leaving only the overwhelming intensity of the moment. I didn't think about my mother or the consequences, or what this meant for our lives. All I could focus on was the way Alfred made me feel, seen, cherished, desired. But as the intensity between us grew, so did the weight of reality. Somewhere in the back of my mind, a small voice whispered that this was wrong, that we were crossing a line we could never uncross. I pulled away, my breathing ragged, and met Alfred's gaze. "What are we doing?" I asked, my voice trembling. He sighed, his forehead resting against mine. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I can't stop. I can't stop thinking about you, wanting you. It's like you've woken something in me that I didn't even know was there." His words mirrored my own feelings, and for a moment, I felt a sense of relief that I wasn't alone in this. But the guilt and fear were impossible to ignore. "What about my mom?" I asked softly. "What happens if she finds out?" Alfred's expression darkened, his eyes clouded with regret. "I don't know," he said honestly. "But I can't lie to you, Emily. What I feel for you, it's real. And I don't think I can pretend it isn't." His honesty was both comforting and terrifying. I didn't know how to respond, how to make sense of the emotions swirling inside me. All I knew was that this moment, this connection, felt too powerful to walk away from. The days that followed were a blur of stolen glances and quiet moments filled with unspoken tension. Alfred and I tried to carry on as though nothing had changed, but it was impossible. Every time we were alone together, the air between us crackled with energy, pulling us closer even when we tried to resist. Then, one evening, the fragile balance we had been clinging to shattered. Jennifer came home earlier than expected, her cheerful laughter echoing through the house as she called out to us. Alfred and I had been sitting in the living room, our conversation low and intimate, when her voice startled us. I quickly pulled away, my heart racing as guilt and panic washed over me. Jennifer didn't seem to notice anything amiss at first, her attention focused on recounting the details of her evening. But as the night wore on, I began to sense a shift in her demeanor. Her eyes lingered on Alfred and me a little too long, her tone slightly sharper than usual. It was as though she could sense that something was off, even if she couldn't quite put her finger on it. The tension came to a head later that night. I was in my room, trying to calm the storm of emotions inside me, when I heard raised voices coming from the living room. My heart sank as I recognized Jennifer's tone, accusatory, sharp, and laced with anger. "You've been acting strange, Alfred," she was saying. "Is there something you're not telling me?" I couldn't hear his response, but the weight of his silence was almost palpable. My stomach churned as I realized how close we were to everything unraveling. I wanted to intervene, to do something to defuse the situation, but I was frozen in place, paralyzed by fear and guilt. When Jennifer's voice rose again, it was clear that she wasn't going to let it go. "If there's something going on, I deserve to know," she demanded, her words cutting through the silence like a knife. I felt a surge of panic, my mind racing as I tried to figure out what to do. But before I could make a move, I heard Alfred's voice, calm but firm. "Jennifer, you're imagining things," he said. "I love you and I wouldn't do anything to hurt you." His words should have reassured me, but instead, they left me feeling hollow. Because even as he spoke, I knew the truth. The fragile world we had created was on the verge of collapsing, and there was no way to stop it. The days after that confrontation were a blur of tension and unease. Jennifer seemed to sense that something was wrong, though she couldn't quite put her finger on it. Her cheerful demeanor turned brittle, her laughter forced, as though she were trying to convince herself that everything was fine. But the cracks in our lives were widening, and there was no way to patch them up. Alfred became more distant, his usual calm replaced with a quiet tension that made every interaction feel loaded. He avoided lingering in the same room as Jennifer and me, his gaze flickering between us with an unease that was impossible to ignore. I couldn't blame him. The weight of what we'd done was crushing, and it was only a matter of time before it all came crashing down. For me, the guilt was suffocating. I couldn't look at Jennifer without feeling like a traitor, but I couldn't bring myself to tell her the truth either. Every time she smiled at me, every time she spoke about Alfred with affection, it felt like a knife twisting in my chest. And yet, there was a part of me that couldn't let go of what had happened between Alfred and me, a part of me that didn't want to. One evening, the tension finally boiled over. Jennifer had been in an unusually quiet mood all day, her usual chatter replaced with thoughtful silences and sharp glances. As we sat down to dinner, the air between us was thick with unspoken words. Halfway through the meal, she set down her fork and looked directly at Alfred. "Are you going to tell me what's going on, or am I supposed to guess?" she asked, her tone calm but laced with steel. Alfred froze, his fork halfway to his mouth, and for a moment the room was silent. Then he set his fork down and sighed, his shoulders slumping. "Jennifer, nothing is going on," he said quietly. "You're overthinking things." But Jennifer wasn't convinced. "Don't lie to me, Alfred," she said, her voice rising. "I can feel it. You've been different, distant. Something is wrong." My heart pounded as I watched the scene unfold, fear clawing at my chest. I wanted to intervene, to say something that would diffuse the situation, but I didn't know how. And then Jennifer turned to me. "Emily," she said sharply, her eyes narrowing. "Do you know anything about this?" The question hit me like a punch to the gut. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. The silence was deafening, and Jennifer's expression darkened as she looked between Alfred and me. "Oh my God," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's you." Her words hung in the air, heavy with accusation and betrayal. I felt my stomach drop as the full weight of her realization settled over us. "Jennifer, it's not what you think," Alfred said quickly, his voice desperate. But she wasn't listening. "How could you?" she demanded, her voice shaking with anger and disbelief. "Both of you? How could you do this to me?" Tears stung my eyes as I tried to find the words to explain, but nothing I could say would make it right. The truth was out, and there was no taking it back. Jennifer pushed her chair back and stood, her movements sharp and deliberate. "I trusted you," she said, her voice breaking. "Both of you. And this is how you repay me." She stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind her, leaving Alfred and me sitting in stunned silence. The sound of her footsteps echoed through the house, each one a painful reminder of the damage we had done. For the next few days, the house was a battlefield of silence and tension. Jennifer barely spoke to either of us, her anger simmering beneath the surface. I tried to apologize, to explain, but she wouldn't hear it. "You don't get to apologize," she said coldly. "You don't get to make this better." Alfred, too, was at a loss. He tried to talk to Jennifer, but she shut him down every time. The man who had always seemed so confident, so composed, was now a shadow of himself, weighed down by guilt and regret. Eventually, Jennifer made her decision. "I can't stay here," she said one evening, her voice flat and emotionless. "I need time. I need space." She packed a bag and left that night, her absence leaving a gaping void in the house. Alfred and I were left alone, the silence between us heavy and suffocating. I couldn't look at him without feeling the full weight of what we had done, and I knew he felt the same. For weeks, the house felt empty, haunted by the echoes of Jennifer's anger and our own regret. Alfred and I tried to talk, to make sense of what had happened, but there were no easy answers. The connection that had once felt so intoxicating now felt like a chain, binding us to the consequences of our choices. And yet, in the midst of the fallout, there was a strange sense of clarity. What we had done was wrong, there was no denying that. But it had also forced us to confront truths about ourselves and our relationships that we had been too afraid to face. And in that confrontation, there was a glimmer of hope, a chance to rebuild, to learn, to grow. But for now, all we could do was face the silence and try to find a way forward. The weeks that followed Jennifer's departure were some of the hardest of my life. The silence in the house was deafening, broken only by the occasional sound of Alfred moving around. Each day felt heavy, weighed down by the guilt and regret that hung over us like a dark cloud. I couldn't look at him without being reminded of the choices we had made, choices that had shattered the life we'd known. But the time alone also gave me space to reflect. I had spent so long trying to suppress my feelings, to pretend that nothing had changed between Alfred and me, that I hadn't stopped to consider why it had happened in the first place. What was it about him that had drawn me in? Was it the way he saw me, truly saw me in a way no one else ever had? Or was it simply the thrill of stepping outside the boundaries I had lived within for so long? For Alfred, the guilt was just as palpable. He carried himself differently now, his usual confidence replaced by a quiet remorse that spoke louder than words. One evening, as we sat across from each other at the dinner table, he finally broke the silence. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "For everything. For what I did to Jennifer, for what I've done to you. I don't know how to fix this." I looked at him, his eyes heavy with regret, and for the first time in weeks, I felt the beginnings of forgiveness stir within me. "I'm sorry too," I said softly. "But I don't think this is something we can fix. Not in the way we want to." He nodded, his expression pained but understanding. "You're right," he said. "But I hope someday we can find a way to move forward. Even if it's not together." His words stayed with me long after that night. They forced me to confront the reality of what we had done and the impact it had on all of us. This wasn't just about me and Alfred. It was about Jennifer too, and the trust we had betrayed. Eventually, Jennifer returned, though things were never the same. She didn't look at Alfred the way she used to, and her interactions with me were polite but distant, as though she couldn't bear to let her guard down. I wanted to believe that time would heal the wounds we had caused, but deep down, I knew that some scars never truly fade. For me, the experience became a turning point. It forced me to confront parts of myself I had spent years ignoring. The loneliness, the longing, the need to feel seen and valued. And while the path I had taken to get there was messy and painful, it also taught me lessons I couldn't have learned any other way. I learned that love isn't always enough to keep a relationship intact. Trust, boundaries, and respect are just as important, and once those are broken, they're not easily rebuilt. I learned that it's okay to crave connection and intimacy, but those needs must be met in ways that don't harm the people we care about. Most importantly, I learned that we are all flawed, and it's in acknowledging those flaws, not hiding from them, that we can truly grow. Alfred and I had made mistakes, but those mistakes didn't have to define us. They could be a starting point for something new, a chance to rebuild, to move forward, to become better versions of ourselves. As I sat alone one evening, staring out the window at the fading light, I realized that forgiveness wasn't just about letting go of what others had done to us. It was about forgiving ourselves too. It wasn't an easy process, and it wouldn't happen overnight. But it was a step I was finally ready to take. Jennifer, Alfred, and I would never go back to what we once were. But maybe, just maybe, we could find a way to create something new. Something imperfect but real. And in that imperfection, there was hope. What would you do if you were in my shoes? Could you face the consequences of following your heart, even when it means breaking the trust of someone you love? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that dive into the complexities of love, betrayal, and redemption. Stay tuned.